Hi, testing 1, 2, 3. My name is Greg Moon. I was born on February 1st, 1947 in Seattle, Washington. My dad had been stationed out on the West Coast during the war in Washington and Idaho. And I left with my mother when I was 2 weeks old, and I've never returned to Seattle, Washington. So you could almost say I'm almost a native of Minnesota. My 77 years have been spent in Minnesota. I was in college out east for about eight months. I was in the Army for 2 years. Otherwise, I've pretty much been in Minnesota
Whole
for
time.
all of my life.
Yeah. What about like your main career?
Well, I'm a pretty detailed guy. I suppose I could have been an accountant. I wasn't, but I graduated with a degree in economics from the University of Minnesota with a minor in business administration and a minor in military science because I was an Army ROTC at the University of Minnesota as well. And I graduated from U in 1969. Actually, I started out at West Point. I was in the class of 1969 at West Point, but I didn't really like West Point.
West Point's like a fancy school, right?
Well,
like,
West
isn't that where
Point
like all
is
the
a very
generals go to school?
West Point. We had a motto at West Point. West Point was, this is before women were allowed. Our motto basically was West Point was a place where 40,000 men wanted to get in, and 3,000 wanted to get out. So, but that really opened up my eyes to a degree.
Yeah.
I had never been on a plane up until the time, other than when I was 2 weeks old, coming back to Minnesota.
Yeah.
But I'd never flown. You know, kids today, they fly all the time. But I hadn't flown in an airplane until after I graduated from high school. And then when I was 2 weeks old, that's the time I flew. So I flew out to New York City and then went up to West Point, reported there on July 1st of 1965.
And this was after.
This was
right
after when
after
I
high school?
graduated from high school.
Right after high school.
By the way, I graduated, a little trivia, I guess, Minneapolis Roosevelt. I graduated in the class of 1965, and we had 831 graduates in our class. We were the largest graduating class in the history of the Minneapolis public schools.
That is large.
Yes. At the time I graduated in 1965, there were 11 high schools in the city of Minneapolis, because Minneapolis used to have about 550,000 population.
550,000.
Yeah, way back when. And then, of course, it went down.
Yeah.
I think it's back up there again. I don't know how much there are now, but...
Yeah. I don't know much about city populations. I just remember, like, I lived in Indianapolis, and I remember there was 2 million people in Indianapolis.
Yeah.
You know, some
Well,
time
the
back,
metro area
that's a lot.
in the Minneapolis, St. Paul area, they call it like probably either the 7-county or the 9-county metro area, and that they have probably between 2.7 and 3 million people. Probably almost half the state's population is in the metro area.
Yeah. So let's hear about Vietnam.
Well, the irony is I was at Fort Hood, Texas. I was a tank platoon leader.
Yeah.
Now, platoon leaders have an MOS, which is the acronym for Military Occupational Specialty. Everybody has one. If you're an enlisted man and you're in the infantry, you're an 11 Bravo. We use the phonetic alphabet, Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, Delta.
Right.
And officers have normally it's a 4-digit, I don't know what it is now, but I was a 1203 because I was a tank platoon leader. And 1542 is an infantry platoon leader. And I became an infantry, well, we'll get to that story, but I was a 1203 at Fort Hood, Texas. And I'm not very mechanical, I didn't want to be in the artillery because I had heard that there were artillery places in Vietnam that got overrun and stuff.
Yeah.
And I had nightmares thinking about that.
Well, because it's a target, I'm guessing.
Yeah, and then they also, I certainly didn't want to be in the infantry. I had no interest in that whatsoever. So I took tanks, because I knew I was going to probably be in a combat branch. So, I mean, that was probably a given there.
That's what I read, like in the beginning of your book, what you were talking about, like you really didn't have much say so, like you could have been sent to infantry.
Well, actually, I had The interesting thing between an officer and an enlisted man, that's what I learned in the Army. The Army will give you two choices if you're an officer,
Yeah.
neither one of which are particularly good for you.
Of course.
The Army's going to win either way.
Right.
And whereas an enlisted man, they just give you an order.
Right.
So simple as that. Now, the interesting thing is when I arrived at Fort Hood, I was in the 2nd Armored Division at Fort Hood. And I met with the Division G1. At the division level, they're called G1, 2, and 3, and 4. G1 is personnel. The acronym is PITS, personnel. P is personnel, I, intelligence, T, training, and S, supply. So PITS, P-I-T-S.
It's the pits.
But at the division level, he's called a G1, the personnel officer in charge of men at that level. And so I met with the G1 of the division, 2nd Armored Division, and he said, well, Lieutenant Moon, what would you like to do? And I said, sir, do you have a desk job? and he kind of laughed. He said, no, Lieutenant, you want to get your hands dirty, which I didn't, but I'm not going to tell him that. So he gave me two options, neither one of which were particularly advantageous to me because I wanted a desk job. The first one was a cav squadron. Now a cav platoon, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
A cav platoon has about 40 men and 10 vehicles. And he offered me that or a tank platoon.
Is that the smallest number of a group?
Actually, a squad is the smallest level operates in the Army.
But a platoon might have 40 people. And
30 to 40 people usually.
And a squad will have?
Squad will have 10 men usually.
Oh, wow, a quarter of that.
Yeah.
So real quick, I guess we should back up just a hair. All right,
Yeah.
So right out of high school, you went to West Point?
Correct.
All right, and then at West Point, you were training, right? But also doing regular schoolwork? Like, is
the
is
first
West
2
Point
months,
only Army?
I got there July 1. So July, August were what they call beast barracks. And it was hell on earth. It was very, very difficult.
Yeah.
I can tell you a funny story if you want to add it to here.
Let's do it.
Okay, I was very nervous during beast barracks.
Yeah.
So one day, our we were being trained by upperclassmen at West Point.
Yeah.
So one day, our leader had said, he said, okay, plebes, we were called plebes because that's a 4th class cadet. From plebeians, from the Roman times. We were the lowlights, if you will. And he said, I want you to stick your hands out if you haven't had a bowel movement within the last 24 hours. And I stuck my hand out, and then he said, how about in the last 3 days? My hand was still out. How about in the last week? My hand was still out. Everybody else was gone. He said, Cadet Moon, how long has it been? 30 days, sir. 30 days? They sent me immediately over to the medical, and I had to give myself an enema.
Oh my goodness.
Seriously.
Was that from stress? That was from stress?
It was all stress, yes.
Yeah.
And then we had what we had. We called it. The upperclassmen called it plebe poop. It was that was the conversation. We had to call it 4th class information. So I had number 1, 2, and 3, and I will tell you those right now. Plebe poop number 1 is, sir, I'm 190 pounds of twisted steel and sex appeal. And plebe poop number was, sir, I'm 185 pounds of rompin' stompin' action and woman satisfaction.
How do you remember this?
Well, I just remember.
Okay.
Well, part of what we had to do at West Point is we had to learn. I became very good at learning things and sticking with them for long term. And then plebe poop number 3 was, sir, I'm a hell of a man.
Nice and simple.
So they would, sometimes at dinner or whatever in the hallway, they'd say, okay, Cadet Moon, give me plebe poop number 2. Sir, I'm 108, that kind of a thing. So you had to do that stuff.
That's bizarre.
Anyway.
So if you went straight into West Point out of high school, and that would have been in 1966,
65.
65.
I graduated class 65.
So you within less than a year, you went straight to West Point.
Well, I graduated on June 9th of 1965, and I was at West Point on July 1, 1965.
No gap. You went straight from
Yeah,
high school.
I basically had 3 weeks before I was at West Point.
And so you got to go to West Point because you were in ROTC.
Well,
within
I
high school?
I had interviewed for West Point. You know, back in my day, there were two shows on TV every week. One of them was West Point Story, and the other one was Men of Annapolis. So you got to see both.
That's the Navy, right?
Yeah, Naval Academy.
Yeah.
So, and I couldn't swim. The embarrassing thing was, even though I'm in Minnesota, the land of actually 14,000 lakes, I never learned how to swim. And so there was no way I was going to Naval Academy because those guys had to swim. Well, little did I know, I had to learn how to swim too. And I did learn how to swim at West Point.
So did you already know that you were going to go to Vietnam?
No. Let me backtrack about West Point. I had to go in the spring of my senior year in high school. 5,000, we had already gone through some interviews and some testing. So it wasn't just the first time. They just didn't send everybody there. But we went to Fort Sheridan in Illinois, north of Chicago. And I don't know if it may not exist anymore. I don't know, but yeah. Fort Sheridan. It was named after Sheridan in the Civil War, a northern commander, Phil Sheridan. Anyway, so I was there. There were 5,000 guys that had already been screened. Now we had been testing and physical and stuff and interviews, and only 500 of them were going to get in to West Point. This was one of the areas throughout the country that they sent potential cadets. So my chances from there were 1 in 10, which I thought, there's no way this is going to happen.
Yeah.
But it did. I got an appointment.
Were they just trying to weed people out based on education and testing?
Well, yeah, you had to test well. You had to be physically and mentally capable.
Yeah.
In other words, you had to have good marks. I graduated 63rd in my class out of 831. So I was in the top. I was in the top 8%.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not.
That's incredible.
I'm not brilliant, so I can just look at something and memorize it. The guy that went to West Point with me was really smart. His name was Art Nab, and I'll talk about him later. So Art and I went to West Point. We got on the plane together and left Minneapolis, and it was quite an adjustment because again, I hadn't been on an airplane since I was 2 weeks old, and I didn't recall that at all.
And at this point, you don't know anything about, like, Vietnam wasn't a thing yet, right?
Well, no, Vietnam was going on. I wasn't particularly aware of Vietnam, but.
So what year did Vietnam start? I know I should tell. But
it was. I think it was in 1965, actually.
Right, 60. Wow. So it was happening. So there wasn't any protests going on at colleges or anything like that. Just
the thing about war is it takes a while for that cycle to go through. Go through a cycle and that, and it's usually if it's done quickly, a war can be somewhat of a popular thing. You've got to get in and get out, though. But if it drags on, then you get people start second guessing what's the benefit of this. And
every time.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Sorry about that. I was like, man, like you went into West Point, and did you know? You're like, well, if I do all this, I'm probably going to go on another flight to Vietnam.
Actually, at the time, it didn't really dawn on me. I watched the Men of West Point that show every week. I just loved that show, and I loved the one thing I remember about that one show. There was a guy that was he was talking with his like physics professors or whatever. I mean, in class about water pressure and what it could do if all the spigots were turned on at the same time. And the instructor didn't think too much of it that had any volition as far as that would cause any problems. Yeah. So he had throughout West Point, they timed it down to the second, where they were going to actually turn on all the hot water, the cold water, all of them were going to be turned on. Showers, everything.
Right.
Flush the toilets, everything at the same time. They burst a bunch of pipes at West Point is what happened.
I thought it would have relieved all the pressure.
Because all the pressure was on and it just, yeah. So they actually had some problems there.
I would have thought it would have been reversed and everything would have been weak.
I don't know what happened to the kid, but I remember that story. It was the actual story.
Everyone knows what happened. You flush the toilet while someone's taking a shower, right? You lose one.
Yeah, well,
yeah.
But Beast Barracks was a very difficult time. I mean, I had never gone 30 days without having a bowel movement. So that was and when the word kind of got around, so I had a bit of fourth class information about that, so I don't have to give you all the details about it, but it had to do with, sir, I was full of shit and I'm not full of shit anymore, that kind of a thing. But they just it was a way of upperclassmen having some fun because
I imagine they were hazing like everything else.
Yeah, oh yeah, you were getting hazed all the time. You had to memorize the days. That's how I became very good at memorizing things because you had to know the days, how many days for this and that. You had to know the menus. There's a lot of things you had to know. Yeah,
you had to know the menus.
Yeah, with food, and if you didn't, if you screwed up some way, they would tell you to recite the days at the table. And by the way, at the table, you had to sit like this.
Shoulders
back. You had to brace, and you had to eat, little plebe-sized bites and that type of thing, and you had to chew. I mean, it was really pretty brutal, is what it was. So even going to a meal wasn't fun.
God, that sounds stressful already. So at some point, you got the news that you were probably going to go to Vietnam. That you were being sent off. You're going to have to get on an airplane.
Well,
and I know because I read the beginning part of your book that day had to come, right? So.
Well, I'll never forget Major Chase, great guy. Major Chase was one of our instructors at the University of Minnesota in Army ROTC. And whenever he would say gentlemen, I would pay attention because there was something that was going to be fairly noteworthy, at least to be aware of. And he said, you'll be able to choose your branch of service now pretty soon. Now, the first choice can be, he said, you have three choices. One of them has to be infantry, armor, artillery, combat engineers, and I forget what there were five of them. They were basically combat. And then the second choice could be those, or one of your choices could be those, and then a couple other ones. Yeah. And then the third choice could be anything you want. And he said, what I would recommend, gentlemen, is that you take the combat branch that you would probably prefer over any of the other ones, because chances are you'll get that, but if you pick something and you don't get it, you might get assigned a combat branch. Yeah. And so I thought, I'd heard stories in Vietnam about, again, artillery fire bases being overrun, and that really scared the heck out of me. And then infantry, I had no interest in being in the infantry. So I thought, well, I'll be a tanker. Yeah. So, and yet I'm very unmechanical. I mean, I don't know.
So why did you go to West Point then?
Well, watching the Men of West Point, or West Point Story, and Men of Annapolis, and again, I couldn't swim, so I wasn't going to go to Annapolis.
So you knew you wanted to join the military in some
I was going to be a career Army officer. Yes, that was my... But, things change, time changes, and, all of a sudden your journey is, it takes you in a different direction. Yeah. But one thing I've always been very detailed. I'm very detailed. I'm probably the most detailed guy that you ever met. And when we're done with this interview, I'm going to show you something that will baffle your mind.
Deal.
Because you won't, and Sarah too. So, but I'm very, very detailed. So engineering made sense to a degree because at the time at West Point, the only thing you could major in was engineering. Now I could major in economics, which is what I did major in at the University of Minnesota. I really enjoyed that discipline.
Yeah.
But
so how many degrees do you have?
I have a degree in economics from the U. When I got out of Vietnam, I came back and I got my master's in business administration at the University of Minnesota, the Carlson School, named after Kurt Carlson, who was S&H Green Stamps, and then he had the Carlson companies.
I don't know about that.
Well, Carlson companies are a pretty big company in Minnesota. They're pretty large. I think a lot of the university gets a lot of people now. They've got supporting them where they get out of the military and they go in and get their MBA at the U. So they have a program
and get
to
paid for it, probably.
help military people. Yeah.
All right. I guess we made full circles because we need to still talk about the day you found out you were going to be flying.
Well, okay. Here's the irony. My company commander sent me to Jungle Operations Training Center.
That sounds fun. Which
is down in Panama. It's at Fort Sherman, the Canal Zone. It was on the northern side of the entrance to the Canal Zone. On the west side, and on the north side, the Atlantic side of the Canal Zone. And Fort Sherman, there were about 192 roughly officers and men that were assigned because they had classes that lasted about, I think it was about 14 days or so, maybe 12 to 14 days, something like that.
Just like jungle safety?
It's the jungle training because a lot of the people that were there were on their way to Vietnam.
Yeah.
Now, I wasn't on my way to Vietnam. Now, here's the irony. The day I left to go to Jungle Operations Training Center, orders came down throughout Fort Hood, Texas. They wiped out almost all the second lieutenants that had at least a year left of Army duty, active duty, and they either they were being sent to Vietnam or Korea, one or the other. Yeah. And they almost literally wiped out the entire post. Very few guys didn't go to one of those places. Okay, and this happened the morning the day that I left. I left in the morning, so I had no idea that I had orders for Vietnam. So I'm doing a Jungle Operations Training Center, and one guy got hurt. We were on a night operation, and one of the guys in our group, and this is one of the few team events they had. I'd done very well. Yeah. I was up near I was near the top. I was probably the top, and the guy got hurt. They had trees that were they had long prongs in the tree. Yeah. And he got into a tree or whatever, and it kind of messed him up, and that slowed us down. And so that cost me being the honor graduate. I would have been the honor graduate had we finished like we were going to finish early and before it even got dark on a night operation. Yeah. So I wasn't too hard on the guy. The guy, he wasn't trying to do that, but I was still in the top 5 graduates, I believe, in our group out of about 92 people. I was very proud of that I had done a very good job.
Yeah, that's good.
So now I'm coming back to Fort Hood, and we got back on a Sunday morning. We were delayed Saturday night. We didn't get a last flight from out of, I think we were out of Dallas. So I had to wait for a flight the next day, got back, and got back to my apartment. We lived off post, my Army roommate and I. And I called in when I got back, as I should, called the officer of the day at our battalion. And he said, while you were gone, a lot of lieutenants got orders for either Vietnam or Korea. I said, well, where am I going? You're going to Vietnam. I was not happy.
And you didn't know any idea?
I had no idea. He told me on the phone. So now I'm thinking, my gosh, and so I think the shock of it all hadn't set in yet. So I think I called my folks, I think I called them almost right away and told them
I would have.
that I would be going to Vietnam probably. And
Yeah.
my orders said that I had to report to Travis Air Force Base. That's where the POWs came back to. It's northeast of Oakland, San Francisco area. It's in Fairfield, California. So I was supposed to report there in June 26th or 7th or something like that. Late June I was supposed to report there.
Yeah.
And I had gotten my orders, this was like February. I knew I was going to Vietnam. So I stayed, I remember we were out in the field for an operation one time in that spring then of 1966. And President Nixon was talking, and he was talking about they were starting to pull troops out of Vietnam, and they were having the Vietnamization program. And I was a little bit nervous about that because I didn't want to be the last guy to be in Vietnam. There's strength in numbers,
Yeah.
and the more people are there, the more the safer you feel.
Yeah.
So, but I knew we were getting out of Vietnam, and that had a profound influence on me because if I had been a career officer and wanting to do well and get promotion and
Yeah.
show them what a good officer I was in combat, maybe I would have taken risks that would have made the men under me that made their tour a little more risky.
Yeah.
I didn't conduct myself that way because I knew at the time I wasn't going to be in the Army. By this time, the Army was not, a career choice in the Army was not there for me. I wasn't going to stay in. So I was just going to go for my 2 years of active duty. And I didn't even know I had more time to serve, but I did. I found that out later. What I decided to do, though, I thought about, I don't have any choice in the matter here. The Army is sending me to Vietnam. And again, I believe in democracy. I believe in decisions that our leaders make.
Yeah.
They don't always make the best decision. But who am I to say to the administration, I don't think I want to fight this war. I want to sit this one out.
A conscientious objector.
Yeah, the people
right?
going to Canada or whatever, that kind of a thing.
Yeah.
So, and I think I really, at the end of the day, I think, Sean, I probably did better in Vietnam in terms of saving lives and taking care of people than I could ever have done in Canada. So I think I had a positive impact on the lives of my men that served under me. None of my men died in combat because of anything that I had done, and that would haunt. I've got a friend of mine that did lose some men in his platoon. He's one of my good friends from my reunion of this 47th Infantry Regiment. We'll be meeting from April 24th to the 28th up at the Columbus Marriott Hotel, and we'll be going to I call it Fort Moore now, after Hal Moore. We were soldiers and young, but it was named after John Benning, who was a Confederate general.
Oh, Fort Benning, yeah.
They renamed a lot of
Georgia.
those forts. But, and I'll tell you, I love those guys. When we get together, they're like family. There's something about being in combat and putting your life on the line for somebody else and watching somebody else's back. I can't describe it. I can't, it's hard to describe combat to people. I remember posting one time on, I have a bunch of Facebook friends. Some of them are my high school class, which is, again, we had 831 graduates. Yeah. We have a huge Facebook presence. And I have a lot of friends that former military, my VFW friends back in the suburb of St. Paul, Mendota Heights.
Yeah.
Actually, we're in Mendota, really. And what I remember mentioning one time on Facebook, I said it was either Veterans Day or maybe commemorate. We don't celebrate anything about war. We always commemorate things. We never celebrate. There's no celebration.
I'm glad you said that.
Yeah. March 29th, by the way, 1973, was the last combat troops had come in from the field. They stood down. We no longer had ground troops fighting actively in Vietnam as of March 29th, 1973. That's why Congress a few years ago designated March 29th as Vietnam Veterans Day. We commemorate.
Right.
We don't celebrate.
Yeah. And so there was still a base there, but that was just for choppers,
rear guard stuff. We still had, there were helicopter pilots there. We had B-52s and things like that. We did have air presence, F-4 Phantoms, but the ground troops, no more ground troops. We had security in some of the rear areas and stuff, but they weren't out actively in combat.
Yeah. Is there still a base in South Vietnam? Is there a military base of any sort?
Well, a lot of our bases have been converted. They do, the one thing about the Vietnamese, and I will mention this. I don't think you had seen it yet in the first 18 pages of the book I wrote, but I didn't understand why we were even there. I mean, I'm half a world away fighting a war against, are these people my enemy? What did they ever do to me? They never did anything to me.
That would be hard.
It was difficult. It was difficult trying to. One night I got sent out because one of the guys in our company, not my platoon, but they had shot a Vietnamese, Viet Cong probably, and so they sent me out as an officer to check to see if this guy was really dead. So I went out there. This guy was lying there on the ground, and here's my thought. And I'm a strong Christian, and probably more so now than even then. But I remember looking down at him. I didn't touch him because sometimes somebody got shot, they could booby trap the body. I didn't want to touch him, but he obviously was dead. Yeah. And my thought was, better you than I, Gunga Din. And maybe that's a sad thing to say as a Christian, but the guy, these people were fighting, and there was a lot of ideas that the Viet Cong don't care about their lives and things like that. I don't think that's true. They were a determined enemy, and they fought a very difficult situation. And the one thing that I've come to realize as a history teacher, and as one who did, I could have, if I didn't want to get a job when I was in college, I would have majored in history. I loved history.
Yeah.
And what I came to realize that people should think about, the Vietnam War was really a conflict. It was never declared a war by Congress.
Yeah.
In fact, we didn't get combat pay or hazardous duty pay. That's what we got. We got hazardous duty pay, which was the same as combat pay. Why didn't we get combat pay? Because there's no war. You can't give somebody combat pay if they're not really fighting. We were fighting, believe me, but we got hazardous duty pay.
I get it.
It's just the vernacular. It's just how you want to preface it.
Yeah.
But I will say this. If you make the analogy between our war of independence against Britain, Great Britain, and our war against the Vietnamese as the dreaded Americans, there's a lot of similarities between those wars. Here you had a backward people, the Vietnamese. Here you had the finest navy, the finest army in the world, Britain back then, Great Britain, and America in the 1960s. So there's a lot of parallels. I've thought a lot about that, Sean, and it's really uncanny how similar they are. We were the dreaded British, and we would say to the Vietnamese, "Why don't you come out and fight like men?" Why? Well, we had all the artillery support and all the air cover. We'd slaughter them. They would hit and run and stuff like that. very similar to what the Americans did during the Revolutionary War.
Yeah.
So we were
That
doing
was
the
like
same thing. It was so, when you stop to think about it, it's just uncanny.
Well, so the War of Independence, wasn't that like when they, when the armies, they would line up in lines, and that was like the rules of engagement?
That's how they used to fight in Europe. Yeah, you'd line up in an open area, and somebody would fall, then the next person would step in, the next fill the lineup.
Well, I read something, and they're like, oh, well, when that happened, that was like the beginning of guerrilla warfare, because they're like, well, I'm going to hide behind a tree.
Yeah.
I'm not going to line up.
Well, when the British were going back from, Lexington and Concord on their way back to Boston, they were getting picked off left and right because there were guys hiding behind trees. And
there's no rules.
Rocks and, they were just, and these guys were farmers, and they could shoot because they had to shoot. That's how they survived.
Hunting.
If you didn't hit that deer or get that rabbit or whatever, you might not be eating that night. Yeah, so it was important. They were good. They were good.
Still doing it to stay alive.
In fact, one of the von Steuben was there from Germany to help train the Americans when we were in the winter time when they were. And
sounds German.
Huh?
Von Steuben.
Von Steuben. Yeah.
Enlighten me.
Anyway, what they finally said, and some of their intelligence, they said, I think they were reporting to General Howe or whatever, and there was a spy there, and he said, General, they have an army now. They are an army. See, at the first, the colonists, they weren't disciplined in that.
That's what you're saying.
But they got trained. They got trained very well, and all of a sudden now they are an army. And so he wanted General Howe to know that you're going to be fighting an army now. For the wintertime, they didn't fight. The British were in nice winter quarters, and they might be in Philadelphia or something.
Yeah.
And the Americans, the colonists, were out in a rural area. And the one thing when they talked about Valley Forge, and I've been to Valley Forge, and just recently, within the last couple of years, I thought that people were freezing at Valley Forge. That's the whole notion that people have.
Yeah.
That's not true. The colonists had some of the best lumbermen in the world, and they built beautiful quarters, cabins that were really well built and tight. And they had to build them every winter because they for all 7 years of the war, they spent a winter somewhere else.
I don't blame them.
But the notion, see, they had about 10,000 troops. They had about 10,000 troops, but then they had a bunch of servers and that to help them, cooks and things. About 2,000 of them died, but they died from like malnutrition or from bad food and stuff like that.
Yeah.
They didn't freeze. They weren't freezing. And that's the notion that I had been led to believe.
Is that in history books or something?
Yeah, the history books and that.
I thought
totally false.
Yeah.
They died from malnutrition. They might have gotten the runs and stuff, and they couldn't stop, and they died. 2,000 of them died out of 10 or 12,000. But they were, most of the soldiers were in good shape.
Yeah.
But it was a lot of the servers and people helping out.
Yeah. Oh yeah, we got off topic a little bit. Oh. So, 71 is when you put feet in Vietnam?
No, I left on about June 28th, and it took me about 23 hours. I logged it. I don't have it with me here now, but I have a log of when local time and the actual time from when I left California, Travis Air Force Base.
So what year are we talking?
We're talking 1970.
1970.
June 1970, late June of 1970.
Yeah.
So I got to Vietnam on, believe it was a day later. Because I crossed the international date line, but I'm going in the other direction. So I'm not adding time, I'm losing time.
Oh yeah, you're going backwards.
Yeah, well, remember
you're losing time
when Chris,
because the international
right,
date line
when
is
Magellan was
yeah.
sailing around the world. Of course, he was killed,
Yeah.
I believe, in Indonesia or whatever. But when they got back to Spain or Portugal or whatever it was, Spain, I think it was, they kept a log every day, and they didn't understand they were missing a day because they had gone from east to west. They lost a day.
Yeah, and they thought they were going to fall off the edge of the earth. So
exactly, yeah. So,
yeah,
but
they didn't realize it was a circle.
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
Yeah. So, if there was one thing you would tell like the general population about the Vietnam War that most people don't know or should know, what would that be?
Number one, here's one thing that people are just amazed by. Do you know how many men were fighting in Vietnam? What percentage were actually fighting in combat? In a combat unit, in a combat role?
No.
10%. It takes about 9 or 10 men to support me or anyone else who's out in the field. And that number is astounding. And that number's been around for a while. It was around in probably Korea.
Yeah.
It was probably around in World War II. The North Vietnamese operated differently. They had probably one guy in 3 was needed to support. One guy supported 2 guys in the field. In America, it was like 9-1. So when we had 575, we peaked at about 575 or 573. There were only about 60,000 doing the fighting. That's all.
Yeah, because everyone's delivering food and setting up camps and
they're handing out
ammo.
Underwear in Saigon or somewhere.
Yeah.
They're doing lots of things, but they're not fighting.
And someone's doing paperwork.
And it's astounding. Yeah, as a matter of fact, paperwork. I had one of my best friend. I won't mention any names, but he graduated from college, and now he gets drafted. So I give the Army a lot of credit. The Army tried to use people in the best area.
Yeah.
And he was a college graduate. So they asked him, can you type? He couldn't type, but he said he could type. So they decided to bring him in the rear. He was in an artillery company or a battalion, and they made him a clerk typist because he's a college graduate. So there's a lot of typing going on in the Army, believe me, back then. Yeah. So they were observing him initially then. They said, you really can't type, can you? He said, no. He said, don't worry, we'll work with you. Because again, they knew, and I had orders. Yeah. I mean, I have, by the way, I made, this is an aside, but my son, who's an Army doctor right now at Fort Liberty, it used to be Fort Bragg, North Carolina, he, when he was younger, he said, Dad, could you tell me a little bit about your experiences in the Army? So what I did is I made up my 201 file, which is your personnel file. Every order I had gotten, every award, every relocation station, he's got a complete copy of my 201 file. I made it up for him.
That's cool.
So he's got that. And my son-in-law and my son have both encouraged me to complete this book, and that's what I've got to try to get going on the book, and that because in a way it's my legacy to my children, my grandchildren, to kind of tell them a little bit about what I was doing way back when.
Well, so the name of your book is The Cord.
The Cord.
And explain that.
Yeah, The Cord.
It's a cool story.
When I arrived in Vietnam at Ben Hoa Air Base, we came into the passenger terminal there, and we were dressed in jungle fatigues with the boots and the green, And on the other side, there was a cord. I don't even know what color it was. I can't remember. Should have been OD, probably olive drab.
Yeah,
but there was a cord right across the terminal there. So one side were the guys that had just come in, some women, and there were Army nurses there and stuff. On the other side, dressed in a class Summer Class A1 uniform, which was a khaki uniform, short sleeve shirt, regular shoes and that. And they looked like Christmas trees because they had all their medals on and stuff like that. I suppose in a way it was somewhat therapeutic for guys to see, hey, they actually get out of here alive, you know?
Yeah.
So maybe in a way they did it by design. I don't know. But they were on the other side of the court. I totally ignored those guys. And let's flash forward real quick.
Sure.
Now I'm on the other side of the court. I'm waiting to leave. I had my khaki uniform on. I had all my medals on like a Christmas tree. And I'm looking across the court at those guys that had just gotten there, the newbies. FNGs, if you will.
Oh, I get it.
Yeah.
That took me a second, but
Yeah.
okay.
Well, I was in Forrest Gump, by the way, too, FNGs, and Lieutenant Dan had said that, too. I didn't go talk to anybody. I didn't want to, I just sat there and I reflected. The fact is that I was now on the right side of the court. But I paid my price. I paid my dues to get on that side of the court. I had to spend 9.5 months, 8.5 of those months were in combat.
Yeah.
By the way, a typical Army officer spent 3 to 6 months in combat and 6 to 9 months in the rear area and a non-combatant position. I was in Vietnam for only 9.5 months, 2.5 months short. But I was in the field in combat for 8.5 months. So I was in combat for 50% longer than the typical officer that was in Vietnam. Okay. And I wasn't happy about it. But, you know, like they say, life's unfair. It was just the kind of luck of what had happened, and that was my experience.
Yeah. And that was when you were leaving, you were saying, like, that was kind of the beginning of the end, right? Like, there wasn't any more.
Well, I was leaving in 71. I left on April 12th. That was they call it DEROS. That's, the acronym is DEROS. That's date of effective return from overseas. DEROS. That's when I left Vietnam on 12 April 71. And I left at 3:30 in the morning. We flew out of Tan Son Nhut Air Base, which is in Saigon.
Okay. And
I landed in Yokota, Japan first, about, I think it's, 10 o'clock in the morning. I can't remember when it was. It was in the morning, though. And then we got back on the plane, and then we flew across the Pacific, and right after leaving Tokyo, within an hour or two, it was dark again. And we were flying across the Pacific.
Yeah, right.
And we landed in Anchorage, Alaska at 12:30, 3 hours before we left Vietnam, because we had crossed the international date line.
Yeah, you're gaining.
Now we're adding a day.
Yeah. That's awesome. Well, before we wrap this up, I am curious. So, and it's always been a little strange to me, but like all the stories you heard when the soldiers were coming back, how like the protesters it was bad, right?
Yeah, it was very bad. For me, it wasn't necessarily personally bad. The people were getting spit on. They were calling us baby killers. I flew back from San Francisco. Here, I'll tell you another quick story. So I get in, we fly down from Alaska down, and we landed at Travis Air Force Base, where the POWs also landed there in Fairfield, California. And then we got bused down to Oakland Army Base. And that's where we did our out processing. You know, the old saying, in by 10, out by 4. Well, that's exactly what happened for Lieutenant Moon. So me and two buddies, two other lieutenants, we grabbed a cab and we're heading to a hotel. So now we're going to order room service. Now, I had just been in Vietnam. I'm really new back to the States there.
Yeah.
And so I ordered, I think it was maybe a BLT, and ordered fries or something like that.
Yeah.
And it came in on sterling silver. It was like they wheeled it in. And I mean, I'm just freaking out. I mean, I lived a life of deprivation for 9.5 months, and they're wheeling this stuff in on us. So silver. I mean, I couldn't believe it. It was just dumb. It was hard to process all that.
Yeah.
Now, I want to flash forward real quickly on one item. I'm interviewing from the first job I got after when I graduated from the University of Minnesota Carlson School of Management, getting my MBA. So I'm interviewing at First Bank Minneapolis, okay, which is now U.S. Bank. So I'm interviewing with HR guy who happens to be a Navy ROTC guy, real sharp guy, and my boss to be. And he had said, well, you know, Tom, Greg had spent a year in Vietnam as an infantry platoon leader.
Yeah.
So I thought, well, it's time for me to say something prophetic here.
Yeah.
So I said, you know, I learned one thing in Vietnam that I will never forget as long as I live. We kind of hunched in close, you know, the physical, making that connection. And I said, the value of a flush toilet. And everybody laughed, and they still hired me.
Yeah,
But
awesome.
yeah, there's things you can.
But you didn't go through any of like what you know, and you watch like old video of like what was happening with the protest to the soldiers, like.
Oh, we were certainly aware of it.
Because
it certainly wasn't. It didn't help our morale at all.
Why go after the soldiers and not the government? Because soldier's a soldier. You do you
Right.
You have orders to do, and you do those orders. And a lot of people got drafted, right?
Exactly. A
And
lot of them
so
were
that
there.
was like not even their choice. So
Yeah.
why did these people here like just take it upon themselves? Like, well, I'm going to take it out on these soldiers. But everyone knows like they're not the ones that.
Yeah.
They were like, I can't wait to go over.
You know, Sean,
know.
when I flew back from San Francisco Airport to Minneapolis St. Paul International Airport,
Yeah.
I had my khaki uniform on. That's what I was wearing. I had my medals on. Nobody said a thing to me on the plane. Person I sat next to, nobody offered to buy me a drink.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't. I guess my point is I was just totally ignored, and being ignored is a terrible thing.
I agree.
Being ignored in life, that's a terrible, terrible thing to have to endure. Being totally ignored in life.
Yeah.
So, but you know, the thing about Vietnam that people are not aware of is, in fact, I mean, just the fact that very few people did the fighting in Vietnam.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that good or bad. We all had a job to do. When I meet someone that didn't fight, I thank him for his service. When I meet someone like me, who's a combat guy, I thank him for his sacrifice, his service, and service, sacrifice, and courage. Well, kind of like courage, or what, you know.
Yeah.
The fact is that he extended himself more. He not only served, he sacrificed. Oh, valor.
Yeah.
Service, sacrifice, and valor.
Yeah.
Valor comes from you're confronted with life and death situations. When you got to cover somebody. When somebody gets hurt and you go out to get them knowing that you might get shot too.
Yeah.
And maybe even like Forrest Gump, maybe you get shot in the buttocks.
I am curious. So, like, when someone comes over to you, you know, someone that's never seen war or something, and they're like, "Thank you for your service." How does that resonate?
Well,
Is it
I
weird?
appreciate it. You know, and in the South, of course, you know, there are a lot more military bases in the South because obviously the weather is more conducive for, you know, 12 months out of the year you can be out in more difficult conditions.
Yeah.
I don't get as much of that in the North. I'm from Minnesota. Not as many people thank me for my service.
Yeah.
They're so much more courteous down here. That's one of the reasons I'm moving down here.
I know what you're saying. There is a difference.
There is.
Yeah.
It's
not just
it's
with the
not,
military
It's not
thing,
subtle.
but-
It's very profound.
Mm-hmm.
There are a lot of people that are very patriotic in the South. There are, and not as much. In fact, they did no, I don't want to get political.
Well, I gotta tell you, when we go, you know, we're from Missouri originally. When we go back to Missouri, it's amazing how it's different. You know, we live in Bend, Oregon. It's beautiful. People are super nice, but there's more manners. like in like southeast Missouri, like the whole south part. I do
Right.
notice. I haven't been everywhere. I could prove that, but I definitely know what you're talking about.
Yeah. Well, all I can say is Vietnam for me was a very profound thing. One thing I learned in Vietnam that bothered me, and I grew up a lot faster than the normal person. I no longer trusted my government. I no longer believed what my government was saying, because what they were saying in Vietnam wasn't true. And I saw it. You know, they might say, for example, oh, they got involved in a skirmish. There were light casualties. Well, if somebody you know died, that might be light for the paper back home in the United States, but it certainly wasn't light for me. By the way, in my second unit, I was with the 47th. I was with Charlie Company. I was Charlie 3-6. 6 is the commander. Your platoon leader. Charlie 6 was the company commander. I was Charlie 3-6, third platoon leader. And we stood down and we were disbanded on 30 September of 1970. I'd been in Vietnam with them fighting for about 3 months. Then I went to the 1st Battalion, 5th Mech Infantry, part of the 2nd Brigade of the 25th Infantry Division. And they took over our Bearcat rear area where I had been for 3 months.
Yeah.
And so, and on the 13th day with this new unit now, we were blowing up a VC bunker complex. I had the demolition experts in my platoon, and somebody tripped off a fragmentation grenade, booby trap, and I got hit. And all of a sudden, I didn't feel a thing. I just looked down at my leg for some reason, or my right leg, and blood was soaking through my fatigues. And the fatigues are baggy. And here's what I said. My God, I bled for Nam. It's exactly what I said. So then I got down, and Doc came over, our medic, and was patching me up in that. And then my company commander came over, because they had, everybody had come by this time to our area, what we were doing. And I said, sir, could you get my camera? I want to get a picture for Mom. And I'll never forget what he said. He said, Lieutenant Moon, how morbid. That's what he said. You never got the camera.
You weren't going to do that.
That was it. But I said, yeah, sir, I'd like to get a picture for Mom.
I would totally do the same thing.
Here's the thing, Sean. When you lose your sense of laughter, when you get all too serious, when the walls close in on you, it's a very dangerous time in combat for somebody. I didn't let that happen. I was very easygoing kind of a thing. I mean, you kind of make a joke out of things. And my worst day was not when I got hit in combat on October 13th, 1970. My worst day in combat was the Ides of March, when Caesar was slain in Rome on March 15th.
Yeah.
March 15th, we got mortared. And there were 15 of us around. 13 guys got hit. 2 didn't get hit, me and one other guy. I carried the last guy in my company, in our battalion. I carried the last guy to die in Vietnam to the medevac chopper. I was in the front of the stretcher, got a guy to help me, and we marched over to the medevac chopper that came in. And then looking down the row after he left, there were 12 stretchers with guys moaning that had gotten hit, and I was just devastated. That was my worst day in Vietnam. March 15th of 1971, I will never forget that day as long as I live. Yeah. And when I've talked to my classmates, they thank me for my service on Veterans Day, or what I tell them usually is, you have no idea, and it's better that way.
Yeah. Totally get that.
Yeah.
Greg, it's kind of running out of time here on this memory card. So
All right.
thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Till next time.
Yes.